Okay, thanks everybody for joining. I see people are still coming in, so we will take a moment just to let everybody process through. But yeah, it gives me great pleasure to start the second of this new seminar series. We're very pleased to have Michael Weber joining us from Chicago booth. So good morning to Michael. Michael will be known to, I guess, probably everybody on here, but he is an assistant professor of finance and then associate professor of finance since 2018. He's a member of the NBR and the CEPR, and he works on many areas of finance, including more recently a lot related to expectations formation, and what he's going to present today, some of his very interesting work on communication by central banks in particular, and in particular the role that the person delivering the message plays in the communication and the expectations formation. So the usual rules will apply. Michael is happy to have me interrupt him. There's a few other people on the panel here who may interrupt during the talk. If you're on as a webinar viewer and you have questions, post your questions in the Q&A part, and I will monitor that on Michael's behalf. And I will when it's opportune moments, I will put your questions to him, and then there'll be some time at the end, hopefully for a bit of a wider discussion. But without further ado, and again, there are many Michaels on this call. So Michael Weber as our speaker, welcome, and I'll give you the floor now.
Okay, perfect. So thanks a lot, Michael, for the kind introduction and for having me today. So what I want to do first is talk a little bit about now setting the stage and some of the work we've been doing a lot with Francesco D'Acunto at Boston College and Yuri Gornichenko and Oli Korobyon, and subsequently then move over and talk specifically, as Michael was alluding to, the role of the messenger in delivering the message for the effectiveness of central bank communication. Now, maybe a little bit of some kind of advertisement. Francesco and I, we are organizing actually a talk NBR conference on inflation expectations in May 19th, if I remember correctly. So the call just went out. If you have any work on that, feel free and please submit. So of course, to this audience, it shouldn't be a surprise that, of course, inflation expectations are central for the modern conduct of monetary policy and ultimately shape also realized inflation. But what we want to focus on today is specifically the perceived real interest rate that is ultimately modulated by household subjective expectations for inflation. And here I just write the Fisher equation. And it's there's now mounting evidence documenting if you have actually high quality microdata, subjective expectations of individuals shape their consumption savings decision, their financial decisions. But, and I think that's particularly pressing in the current situation, potentially also their wage bargaining and labor supply decisions. But I think, that's particularly an area of research that we hopefully see more research coming out in the next couple of months, because ultimately I think that's what's currently going on, in particular also on both sides of the Atlantic. And if you actually listen to policymakers, one of the pre-COVID kind of cushy, I think, policy narratives, they oftentimes said to the extent inflation expectations are well anchored, policymakers move around policy rates, and this actually then transmits into movements in perceived real interest rates, and then that you can potentially manage aggregate demand. But of course, in particular in situations when you are stuck at a effective lower bound on policy rates, to the extent that actually you can move around to communication potentially, subjective expectations of inflation, you can actually still potentially shift aggregate demand by actually shifting perceived real interest rates. So now what I want to do is just, show a little bit of to which extent we might actually believe that indeed households, at least in the similar evidence is present for firms, have actually well anchored inflation expectations. So this is from some work with Oli and Yuri, which we done in 2018. So when realized inflation was at or below 2%, we just asked 25,000 Americans, what do you think is the inflation rate the Federal Reserve tries to achieve over longer periods of time? And so what you see here is, there's indeed a fraction of people, about, a little bit less than 20% of 25,000 representative Americans that seem to actually have somewhat of an idea potentially of what the inflation target is. But what you also see in 2018, about 40% of our survey respondents thought, in fact, that the Fed tries inflation target or has an inflation target of more than 10 percentage points. And this doesn't mean that inflation expectations don't matter. So, for example, I'll show you some evidence later on. If we actually are able to reach households, in the times of low inflation, you could think of a picture like this, be a reflection of some form of rational inattention. So if you are able to pierce the veil of ignorance on the part of households, you actually are able to move households' inflation expectations and then indeed also shift their consumption expectations. But I think, in normal times, many households typically don't pay that much attention. Of course, they're even not all households or individuals are created equally. So like one of the starkest difference, if you look at, which demographics help us explain heterogeneity in inflation expectations, is in fact gender. This goes back to an old paper by Jonung, who was documented in the early 80s already that, everyone has upward bias inflation expectations, but actually the upward bias seems to be substantially larger for women relative to men. So this is just, from the New York Fed survey of consumer expectations. Just download that data, collapsed by gender. You see, this is data up to 2018. Everyone has somewhat upward biased expectations, but the bias is substantially larger for women than for men. So this is across individual households. What we do here instead, in some work with Francesco and Ulrike Malmendier, we ran our own survey on this Nielsen Homescan panel. And I come back to that panel in a second. And the nice feature of that panel is, on the one hand, you can actually zoom into the household and actually elicit expectations within household for the male and the female household head, allowing you to keep constant lots of things that oftentimes vary across households, like, a living situation, kids, and things like that. But at the same time, in this panel, we can also observe pretty much at the daily frequency what people are purchasing in their non-durable consumption bundle. So anything that has a barcode and households purchase, we actually can observe and match to their survey responses. Now, what you see in the left panel within households, if we just plot what we call here the gender gap in expectations, women's expectations for inflation over the next 12 months relative to men's within household, you see there's a gender gap even within household of about 0.4 percentage points. But then in the right panel, what you see here, we just simply split our sample of households into those households in which the male household head declares that it at least partially participates in grocery shopping, versus actually households. So this is the white plot here, and versus households in which the male household head declares never to participate at all in grocery shopping. And so you see this unconditional gender gap increases by about 40% within households in which the female household head is the sole grocery shopper, versus it fully disappears in which the shopping duties are somewhat split across household heads. And it is because the male household head also has actually higher inflation expectations. So it somewhat indicates that being exposed to volatile grocery prices might matter to the extent to which households actually form inflation expectations. And I come back to that actually now in the next couple of slides. You can, of course, indirectly ask households, what are the type of sources of information you would typically use to form inflation expectations? And so here we had a randomized order, all those different options you see here on the bottom of the graph. And then we just say, well, what are the top 3 sources? Top source got a 3, the second top source a 2, the top third source a 1. And then we just look at the average score, and you see by far the most important source of information seems to be own shopping experiences. Like, the prices you see in the supermarket seems to be most relevant for how households form inflation expectations. So what we then did, we actually levered the fact that we actually do observe what prices people pay and what goods they are purchasing in their day-to-day shopping bundles. And so therefore, we just created, similar to what the BLS would be doing, like a chained last pair price index, fixing in a base period a year before we measure inflation, what are the goods households actually purchase. And then we just create, based on this non-durable shopping bundle, measures of realized inflation at the household level. And then we just bin households across, realized inflation over the previous 12 months 8 means the eighth of household with the highest realized inflation, 1 with the lowest realized inflation. You just see that, those that had high realized inflation in the past think that overall CPI inflation will be about, 0.4, 0.5 percentage points higher than those with the lowest realized inflation. Now, of course, grocery prices are highly mean reverting. So like, if you look at realized shopping bundle inflation at the household level, you don't see any difference going forward. So it looks like indeed you focus on what happened in your shopping bundle in the past to form future inflation, but it's not the case that they think about, their own bundle or are better in forecasting their own bundle. They just actually seem to extrapolate to overall inflation. And now 2 things that you don't see here in the plot, but that we show in the paper. The fact that non-durable price changes already seem to matter for inflation expectations formation might already be indicative of that. But so what we then do, instead of weighing price changes by expenditure shares, we weigh them by the frequency of purchase. Like a good example is milk. For everyone, milk has a tiny expenditure share, but some purchase milks like, 5 times a week, others once a month. You see that once you weigh by frequency, the explanatory power of realized inflation is way stronger for expected inflation. So they extrapolate more from frequently purchased price changes. And the second part is households tend to put a higher weight on positive relative to negative price changes, which of course then also means like, you see like an initial inflationary surge within a category that households purchase frequently, that immediately leads to an increase in households' inflation expectations. What we, for example, saw in April of 2020 already, maybe this initial impulse comes back down again. Inflation expectations of households will not, because they actually don't put much weight on price decreases. They're less salient and noticeable to households, which is something we directly show at the individual level in this paper as well. And, this is just, it's a kind of a teaser of what I was just saying, in the sense like, you can directly ask which prices did come to mind when you thought about overall inflation. And so people indeed think about very peculiar and specific goods like, milk, the price of gas, bread, but there are also potentially some interesting gender differences now. This was in the US, like, milk is more important for women than for men. Beer slightly more important for men than for women. In Germany, I would expect beer way more important for men, for example, things like that. But indeed, it looks like people tend to focus on very specific price changes when forming overall inflation expectations. Now, the second thing I briefly want to mention, because this directly motivates why we think that the complexity of policy and the way it's communicated does indeed matter for the extent to which individuals would incorporate messages and communication into their own expectations. This is now also some work with Francesco, Daniel Huang, and Marita Palovita, in which we actually went to Finland, because for all men in Finland, we can observe a measure of IQ from a military entrance type test. And so, 9 here means just within a given cohort, that's like the top 4% in terms of scoring on this IQ test, 1, the bottom 4%, and then it follows somewhat of like a discretized normal distribution. And so what we are doing then, just plotting here, take the data from the European Commission consumer survey for Finland, take the answer, what do you think will inflation be over the next 12 months? Look at what is realized after 12 months, take the difference, absolute value, and then just actually average by bin of IQ. You see the mean absolute forecast error being a whopping 4.5 percentage points for the bottom 4% of the Finnish male distribution by IQ. It's monotonically decreasing, but it's still quite sizable for the top part of the Finnish male IQ distribution. And we also, again, directly show that this is unrelated to education and income, so it seems to be indeed driven by more innate cognitive abilities. And so here, let me directly show that the type of message matters for how people would adjust their consumption plans, but also inflation expectations. So together with Dakunto and Huang, we looked actually at 2 policy announcements in German households, and the same type of European Commission survey for Germany. Top panel, you see like inflation expectations of the share of Germans that expect higher inflation going forward. Bottom panel, do you think it is a good time to purchase larger ticket items? And then we focus on 2 announcements indicated by the vertical lines in the left panel. That's when former Chancellor Merkel just had taken power and then announced that in 14 months' time, in January 2007, we will increase value-added tax from 16 to 19%. And those two lines are the first two announcements of explicit uses of forward guidance by Mario Draghi, when he said we'll keep interest rates at current or lower levels for an extended period of time, or he firmly reiterated in January of 2014 the same statement. And what you see is, while theoretically, should operate exactly through the same mechanism, a consumer oil equation. If I tell my dad, VAT goes up, he understands, maybe it makes sense before prices increase to purchase a new car, and indeed inflation expectations are higher. If I tell him, like, inflation, the forward guidance will be inflationary in the future, so therefore today you should update already inflation expectations and start out consuming more. Clearly, he didn't react, at least the average German didn't actually react at all to this message. So it looks like potentially the complexity or simplicity, of course, paired with potential supply side responses like car dealers, supermarkets, and so on, does play a role in the extent to which people actually adjust their consumption, but also inflation expectations to policy announcements. And so to directly bring a little bit more of causal evidence to that, so like we went back to Finland and did a survey experiment where we took official tweets from Olli Rehn, the governor of the Bank of Finland, and tried to disentangle like whether this simple versus complex message might indeed potentially play a role in the extent to which households interpret and react to policy messages. So like, I'll be more precise how those survey experiments are set up when I talk about the paper with Francesco and Andreas in a second. So, but imagine like, you elicit expectations and things like that, then you split your sample, and then, randomly one subset reads a tweet in the survey by Olli Rehn that says, don't you worry, we'll make sure that none of the Finnish households will be worse off because of the pandemic relative to before. Another subset of the survey population, again, gets a tweet by Olli Rehn, the same sender, Olli Rehn, same kind of channel, Twitter, but just a different message in which he was stating, announcing the PEPP, like a large-scale asset purchase program by the ECB, associated with a pretty large number. And then we just ask households, to which extent do you think those policies will benefit households in Finland? And 7 means benefit a lot, 1 means benefit a little, announcing that, don't you worry. That's a red histogram. We see it's fully, the whole distribution shifted to the right relative to we implemented a PEPP. In black, you see, so indeed, like a simple message, just telling them like, inspired potentially by what Mario Draghi did in his whatever it takes speech, indeed seems to be successful in kind of like, increasing the optimism of households. We also directly show that the income expectations increased by about $100 after this announcement relative to before. So it looks like that simple messages indeed are successful in moving expectations. And now just coming back, so that we saw that potentially the message matters. So here from some work with Olli and Yuri, I want to briefly just indicate that even like, the medium could potentially matter. And this is now, I want to, mention one caveat. So this is research in the US, which is of course a highly, polarized society in recent years, maybe even previously. And so like what we have been doing there is also like, a survey experiment. So you elicit prior inflation expectations, you randomly split your sample in different groups, you provide them in a randomized fashion different pieces of information, and you elicit expectations again immediately afterwards, but also after 3 and 6 months. And what I'm highlighting here, so like one subset of our survey population received the official FOMC statement to read. Typically we would think super dense and highly complicated language, nothing for ordinary households, but crucially, it also contained current inflation, the inflation forecast, and the Fed inflation target, versus the coverage of the same FOMC statement the following day in the USA Today. Again, first paragraph at current inflation, target, and forecast, written, of course, for a very simple audience. Nevertheless, you see that the forecast revision in subjective inflation expectations is about only half as big if households read the USA Today article relative to the official FOMC statement. And then in the paper, we dig a little bit deeper and we document that it's largely because official print media and like traditional news media in the US more generally is not perceived as credible source of information by the large chunk of the population in the US. Relative, surprisingly, this is like the US setting to social media, for example. And then we show, and this I think is crucial, given also this debate that came up at some point in Q3 last year in the US, do inflation expectations matter at all? So what we show here, and I think that's at least I could think of the cleanest evidence we can provide, we see at the individual level using scanner data what happens to households' consumption after they receive our information treatments. And indeed, we find that households that exogenously, because of our treatments, have higher inflation expectations, immediately go out and start buying more non-durable goods. So I think this whole idea that inflation expectations of households are crazy and they don't matter, I think we can finally once and for all forget they indeed do shift actual decision of households.
Michael,
yeah.
can I just want to pose a question before you move on. One is, well, there's two that's come in. One's just come in now, but the first one sort of takes you back to your discussion of household baskets and exposure to different price changes, and that comes from Ben Norman. I'm assuming it's the Ben Norman, who's my former colleague at the Bank of England, which basically says for years his the prices in his shopping bundle have been a mix of things going up, some going down, and all these additional complications, 2-for-1s, etc. But now in recent months, it's very clear that basically everything's going in one direction. And he's asked, do you think the formation process, is this non-linear process whereby there'll be a lot more impact of price changes when they're all in the same direction, or do you know of stuff that points in that direction?
So that's actually a super interesting thought. So Francesco and I, we've been recently looking at, we did a little bit of a similar intuition. So we were splitting households into those households, who always purchase at the same shopping outlet versus those that split their shopping across many, many different outlets. And so our idea of reason for doing that was to say, if I always go to the same grocery chain, the type of goods I see, the type of prices I see there are kind of homogeneous. Instead, if I once go to Whole Foods, Trader Joe's, Aldi versus Mariano's, I have lots of confusion in my head. And in fact, I might actually not use the price changes while shopping all that much in forming expectations. And that's indeed what you see. What we argue is what we call a lot of shopping concentration. So you always go to the same outlet. You rely way more on the price changes to form inflation expectations that you see by going there. And so now applied to the question of Ben, I think actually that's indeed most likely the case. But so far I haven't really seen anyone doing that. Unfortunately, we have also the issue that we can't directly do it because this Nielsen home scan data always lags by kind of 18 months until we can see the actual consumption data. But I certainly would think that it's likely what's going on in the data and would be curious to see that indeed.
Okay, and then the second one comes from Jonathan at the Bank of Israel. I think relating to exactly the slide that's on screen, so I'm glad I paused you here. He asked, do you control for the complexity of the FOMC announcements?
Yeah, so that's an excellent point. So here we don't control for anything. And, I think his question hints towards the fact that the FOMC statement is way more complex relative to the years today. So if anything, if the complexity was identical, if anything, I would even expect that potentially the forecast revision, so the way we have to think about this, those numbers here, ex ante, everyone has too high expectations on average, and then they adjust towards the provided information in the article. I might even expect larger revisions if the FOMC statement was written in a simpler language, indeed.
Okay, thanks.
So can I also come in?
Yeah, okay.
Someone else wanted to do. Go ahead.
All right. So now that Michael, the organizer, has opened the floodgates, let me ask one too. So if you showed me this evidence based on households and micro data, and if I knew nothing about U.S. inflation, right, and after showing me these, asked, what do you think U.S. inflation has been, right? I would never have said, it was 1.5% for years and years and years. So how does this, in the end, aggregate into the U.S. inflation that we observe? That the households do have the crazy expectations, and actually they do behave according to those crazy expectations. But somehow, inflation has been, until a couple months ago, extremely well behaved.
So like, that's an excellent point. So like, this is also something Francesco and I at some point have looked a little bit into. So like, and this is also really consistent with some work by Mirko Wiederhold and Nate Wellerkop. So what they document is that individual fixed effects in a panel data can explain lots of the variation across individuals in their inflation expectations. Like, imagine, so Refat, you are a reasonable guy on average, you expect inflation of 2%. I'm a crazy guy, I expect inflation of 10%. This doesn't now mean that, the level differences directly tell us, that I'm crazily consuming and you're maybe more saving, but like the changes relative to our average level of expectations are very informative. What I mean by that, so like, if I now would, let's say, reduce my expectations from 10 to 8%, I would actually then, in fact, in data, consume less now, versus if you increase it from 2 to 3%, you would increase your consumption. And that's indeed what you see in like, the European Commission data. So like, changes in expectations are really informative, or whether you think it will be going up, down, or stay the same. But the pure level is actually, there you have this issue that you kind of have to take out the average perception of inflation to some extent.
I see. But then from that, I understand that next time you show me this graph where, so many people expect inflation to be 10% plus, I should have asked you, why are you showing me this? Show me the changes graph.
If you want to directly link it to choices, indeed.
Yeah, can I also come in here? As Refat said, now the floodgates are open. You were going so fast, it was very hard. By the time I unmuted, you'd already moved on to the next. But I have one comment on this slide, and then another one on the earlier inflation expectations. I mean, you have highlighted the FOMC statement in USA Today coverage, and the coefficients are sort of, a third for USA Today, and then you say print media is less effective because it's less trustworthy in the US. Yes and no. I mean, conditional on people reading that stuff. Now, of course, USA Today is read by many, many more consumers than the FOMC statement, right? I mean, just sort of, I think that's an important qualifier here. Yeah. So if the Fed can get their messages to USA Today, they might not actually change expectations by the same amount than if they were managing to get people to read the FOMC statement. But I mean, you reach many more people. And I think that is sort of the big crux in central bank communication with the general public. How do you actually reach these things?
So like, I'm totally with you. So like, let me just briefly, that's what I meant earlier. Like, the biggest challenge is kind of piercing the veil of inattention or ignorance. So like, you have to get through. And so like, the way I would read this table is conditional on getting through what is actually more or less effective. So it's more like then, an intensive margin of the reaction.
Right. And I have a question on the inflation expectation formation. You talked about, the people who do the grocery shopping and not. I think there's very interesting earlier research by Daniel Levy on Israeli households, where they surveyed households or people that came out of a supermarket and asked them, do you actually remember what you bought and how much you paid for that? And they did this in wealthy areas, I think of Tel Aviv, and in less wealthy areas, right? And in the wealthy areas, people had no idea. They go in, they buy the stuff, they are not operating on a budget constraint. So they don't even see the prices, right? Whereas, people on the budget constraint know exactly to the cent how much they actually spend, right? Or, think of people being hand to mouth or not. So do we know anything whether there's also a difference here? To what extent sort of grocery experiences, how they affect inflation expectations depend on whether I'm on the budget constraint?
Yes, like all of the regressions, we always directly control for income, but also like in the raw data, so like if you look uncontrolled and controlling for income, the coefficient didn't move much, which, when we could simply look at interactions and sample splits, we haven't done that, but this would tell me at least like there doesn't seem immediately a strong correlation. But of course, this is also like within the sample of Nielsen Homescan panelists. So that's like why I'm a little bit want to make a clear kind of a caveat here that I'm not sure whether potentially there's no role of kind of income for the extent to which you use past observed price changes to form expectations might hold in the general population.
Mike, just one last one, and then we'll let you free for a moment. So Catherine Mann asks, essentially, if we take away this idea that higher inflation expectations lead to higher consumption, and then higher consumption leads to an actual rise in prices, do we actually ever see that kind of spiral, I guess, in the data?
So that's actually a great question. So and we've thought a lot about that, whether there's a way with the microdata we could show that. And so I think in normal times, especially because we thought about using also more spatial heterogeneity and then looking at that. So one issue we faced in normal times in the US, you have lots of uniform pricing. So those local effects we were hoping to exploit didn't really play a role in the pricing of most supermarkets. But I think right now this could potentially, once we have access to the more recent data, something to look at. But at the micro level, you can effectively identify those, expectations, spending, price increase, expectations, kind of spirals. I think that's certainly something we would want to look at indeed.
Okay, and I know I said the last one, but I see Julia has her hand up. So Julia, you go, and then we will let you move on.
Yeah, sorry. I was interested by you went very quickly on the chart on unconventional fiscal versus monetary policy effect in Germany.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you can give us a bit more details. Is it because of what Michael Ehrman was saying before, that central banking is not reaching the public, the message? Or do you think it's more because of the transmission mechanism that is slower and also more difficult to understand?
So I think that's a great question, Julia. So I think most likely it's a combination of both. The reason why I'm saying that, this is of course just an average plot. So in the paper we also do careful to try to do some more careful identification. You matching households in Germany with households abroad and doing a different analysis. And so then within that analysis we document that if you look at subsamples, high low education, high low income, urban, rural, all of that, everyone reacted identically to the unconventional fiscal policy, versus no one reacted pretty much to the forward guidance announcements. So that's why I think potentially the simplicity did play a role. And the second part is, and I think I was partially maybe referring to it as supply side responses. We also got data from media tenor, and we document, for example, when the VAT was announced to increase and the actual increase happening, there was lots of discussion of that in the German media, versus pretty much no discussion in the German media, neither in tabloid style media or more kind of high quality newspapers about forward guidance announcements. So there was a little bit of mentioning, but certainly not enough to really be noticeable to most Germans.
Okay, we let you proceed now for a while.
Okay, so now I talk and want to focus on the last part, the role of the messenger. And this is joint work with Andreas Fuster, who's now at EPFL, and Francesco. And so a motivating picture is here, when Christine Lagarde took the helm of the ECB and then, posted on Twitter that she had an informal, a nice gathering with colleagues on the governing council. And while I'm personally not on Twitter, what I've been told is called a shitstorm happened subsequently. And so people were outraged, saying, well, is it really just white men? Does this look like an informal and open discussion, and so on? That's true in Europe. It's also true in the US. We slowly now see a change given all the confirmation hearings occurring these days in the US. But there's possibly, of course, many good reasons why we might actually think that more diverse policy-making body could potentially increase the effectiveness and be a good ethical and equity goal. So Christine Lagarde herself actually brought what we label here a legitimacy reason. Ultimately we should mirror the society we serve. Sharon Donnery was making the point that if we have people with different experiences and backgrounds, it might help us alleviate concerns of groupthink and ultimately result in better decisions. Of course, super relevant reasons and channels, but Francesco, Andreas, and I didn't think that we have anything to add to this debate. So therefore, we actually wanted to focus on a last potential mechanism channel, which we label an inclusive or effective communication channel that Jay Powell was highlighting and saying that, if you have diverse organizations, you might be better able to relate to and talk to certain populations. And so that's pretty much what we are after. We want to understand whether us making salient the female or minority representation on the Federal Open Markets Committee might differentially affect the extent to which men versus women, white versus minority survey participants take into account identical messages that we provide in the survey. And so the way we do that is through a large-scale survey experiment with about 9,000 survey participants. And then we also want to shed a little bit of light through the mechanisms and channels, so whether a trust in the Fed and information acquisition channel might play a role. And then in terms of the specific kind of underlying drivers, we want to differentiate what we call homophily, so like a tendency that I might associate more to Michael because Michael shares my same name. So I might more paying attention to people that kind of look like myself. If this was an underlying force, then we could be potentially concerned that the majority population, the white men, might be put off once they see a female or a minority policymaker. Alternatively, it could be that underrepresented groups at the time of our study, so women and Black survey participants, they might actually have a taste for diversity and might actually perceive, relatively speaking, outsiders as more credible, trustworthy, and might more react to their statements relative to the majority group that might just not care at all who's delivering the message. So now let me just briefly mention, the key finding is that women and Black survey participants are more likely to incorporate the information we provide in the survey when it is associated with a female or a Black male policymaker relative to observing the same message delivered by a white male policymaker. And we don't see any offsetting or countervailing effect on a white man, independent of who is delivering the message. And then we show that women and Black survey participants just increase their degree of trust when they see a female or a minority policymaker, but they're also actually more likely to actively acquire information about monetary policy making if it is associated with a female policymaker. So now, the key difference of our paper relative to lots of the literature, many also here in the audience have contributed to, is the fact that we want to understand, who is communicating instead of what is communicating and the role it plays for the effectiveness of communication. So we set up the survey in 4 stages. In the first stage, we listed prior expectations, some basic demographics, the level of informedness of monetary policy making, and to the extent people know who's in charge of monetary policy. Then the key stage in our survey was the second stage, in which we just take our 9,000 people and just actually randomly split them in 7 groups. One group, the control group, doesn't get any relevant forecasts, and I'll show you what they see in a second. Then we have 6 treatment groups. 3 treatment groups receive a forecast for the unemployment rate. There's 3 treatment groups of forecasts for inflation. 2 see a picture of Mary Daly, 2 of Raphael Bostich, and 2 of Thomas Barkin. So we have this intersection that 2 people, obviously given policymaker, but different forecast unemployment versus inflation. And so one thing I briefly want to mention, all 3, of course, are regional Fed presidents. All 3 were non-voting members in the meeting from which we drew the forecast in June of 2020. Now, our control group, just to make sure everyone has to read the same amount of text and has a logo or figure to look at, just sees the official emblem of the Fed, and then also a brief description, what the Federal Reserve System is and the FOMC. And just to ensure that, we increase the likelihood that people indeed read the text, we forced them to stay on the screen for at least 20 seconds before they could continue. Now, 2 treatment groups saw this picture by Thomas Barkin, the president and the CEO of the Richmond Fed. And then we just, introduce him for a second, and then like provide forecasts from the Survey of Economic Projections that the Fed thinks that the inflation rate in 2020 will average 0.8% and 1.6% in 2021. One group who also received the unemployment forecast with a picture of Thomas Barkin, and I'll show you those unemployment numbers in a second. Two groups saw a picture of Raphael Bostic, President and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. Here again, you see the one treatment group screen that saw the inflation forecast. And then two screens saw a picture of Mary Daly, President and CEO of the San Francisco Fed. And this time I show you just the unemployment forecast of 9.3% in 2020 Q4 and 6.5% in Q4 of 2021. Now, of course, you might say, like, those forecasts are pretty off for inflation, and the unemployment rate doesn't matter at all for our setup because, everyone receives the same forecast, and all we are interested in, whether it matters whether I now see Mary Daly versus Raphael Bostic. Now, of course, one concern with this design is, many things differ between, let's say, those two pictures, suit versus maybe more casual outfit, or how you want to call it. So we're doing an auxiliary analysis, like, how do you rate the level of confidence, trust? What do you think are their positions? And you don't see any noticeable difference. Like the first order difference is like white woman versus black man. And we find that indeed in some manipulation proof tests, what we call that in the paper. Crucially also is like, there's no face recognition at all. So like if you provide the pictures of Mary Daly, Raphael Bostic and Thomas Barkin to any non-selected sample in the US, and you ask them, who do you think that person is? What do you think that person is doing professionally? People have no idea. They think like Thomas Barkin would be a lawyer, for example. Anyways, like then the third part of the survey, we just actually elicit posterior expectations, Mansky style, meaning we elicit a subjective distribution for future outcomes for inflation and the unemployment rate. And then the fourth part, which set of demographics like age, income, marital status, home ownership, education, gender, political leaning, and things like that. So now, as I said, about 9,000 people, 50-50 male, female. We slightly oversampled African Americans just to make sure that in case we wouldn't find any result, we would actually not, couldn't say that it's due to lack of statistical power. And we ran the survey after the August meeting, and was to a large extent done by the Jackson Hole meeting in end of December, but we have surveyed the fixed effects in all of our specifications. And we can also focus on those that finished before Jackson Hole. So now what I want to do is actually mainly focus on some graphical evidence and some regressions where I compare four groups: white men, women, black men, and black women. And first some graphical evidence, and also like regressions where we have in total about 65 fixed effects in there. So keeping constant lots of things that potentially might systematically vary across subpopulations. And so now what I want to first do is actually look at an anchoring indicator, or saying differently, to which extent are people like, reacting to the provided forecast. Like we had forecasts for the unemployment rate of 9.3 and 6.5, and for inflation of 0.8 and 1.6. And we asked them for a forecast for 12 months, which is pretty much in between in terms of time horizon, those two forecasts. And now we say, or create a dummy that equals 1. If the modal bin in the subjective forecast distribution covers one of those two forecasts. That's just one simple way of seeing, like, do people actually indeed, like, anchor on that expectations that we provide in the survey? But of course, the whole distribution is of interest potentially. So therefore, we also look at the imputed mean of the posterior distribution. And then we also want to study, like, treatment effects relative to the control group, and compare, like, treatment effects relative to seeing Bostic, Barkin, or Mary Daly. Now, of course, there's lots of information on this slide. So let me just graphically explain what we are doing. So here the control group didn't receive any information. Here we focus on white respondents, dark gray men, light gray female respondents. Control group that doesn't receive any information, 32% of women, has anchored expectations as defined by putting the most mass on the bin that covers the official forecast for the unemployment rate. white men, about 56% anchored expectations, according to that definition. The first thing you see, if you go from the 2 left bins to all the other bins, providing information increases the share of survey participants having anchored expectations. So providing information is indeed useful if you, as Michael was saying, if you reach households. The second thing I want to draw your attention to is the fact that if you focus now on the treatment effects, a white woman seeing Thomas Barkin relative to not receiving information, you see like a 16 percentage point increase of the share of white women having anchored expectations, but its treatment effect is 50% larger or 25% larger if white women see Mary Daly or Raphael Bostich relative to observing the same information but being associated by a picture of Thomas Barkin. And the last thing I want to highlight, independent of who white men see, they have the same share of anchored expectations. So there's no put off or negative effect of making salient the diversity or the minority representation on the FOMC when it comes to the same identical message. So let's move on to Black male survey respondents and female respondents. So what we are showing here again, like control group, no information, treatment group receiving a forecast. Everyone has a higher share of anchored expectations, so providing information indeed matters. You see, like, however, for example, in this case, Black female survey respondents only have about a 4 percentage point higher share of anchored expectations when they see Thomas Barkin relative to not seeing any information. But this actually treatment effect is substantially larger. It's 10 percentage points when they see a forecast being associated with with Raphael Bostich. And in fact, it's actually 16 percentage points if they see the same forecast being associated with Mary Daly and compared to like only 4% percentage points with Thomas Barkin. And here you see, like, for Black male survey respondents, they react about equally to Barkin and Bostich and slightly less to Mary Daly. Just maybe in the interest of time, like, you can do that also in regression form, but I want to talk about a few additional things here that I think actually are worth highlighting. So that we remember we had actually like 3 treatment groups for the unemployment rate and 3 treatment groups for inflation. So if you look at the same setup of the figures, but this time for inflation, you do see that providing inflation information is helpful in increasing the share of survey participants with anchored expectations. So look at the left panel, for example, here. But here you also see that there's no differential treatment effect, whether white women see the same forecast associated with Daly, Bostich, or Barkin. Doesn't matter to the extent to which they have anchored expectations. And again, no differential reaction for white men either. For Black respondents, it's also roughly similar. There's maybe slightly bigger, but we don't want to make too much out of that effect for Black female respondents if they see Bostich and Daly. And so the way we think about that is like, inflation, if you think about it, it's a way less personal variable potentially. So there, the identity and kind of lived experience and the trust in a given policy maker might matter way less. And at the same time, I think personally, that's actually one of the key differences also. We do see large differences in labor force attachment, unemployment rates across men and women, white and Blacks in the US. We don't really see that in terms of realized inflation. So like some nice work by David Argente in normal times, there's lots of dispersion in realized inflation, but like observables like race and income, at least in normal times, there's no predictive power really for differences in realized inflation, which we think could potentially be helping us making sense of this, large treatment effects, but no differential treatment effects across different policymakers. So now what I want to do is like shed a little bit of light on potential mechanisms and channels that actually might mediate these effects. And so like the first one I want to focus on is a trust in the Fed channel, and the second an information acquisition or attention channel. And so here subsequently to our intervention, we asked people, to which extent do you think that the Fed is adequately managing inflation and the unemployment rate? Left panel. And the right panel, to which extent do you think the Fed cares about the well-being of all Americans, including people like yourself. 7 means a lot, 1 means a little. Now, given that we ask those questions after our information experiment, here we only focus first on the control group to see whether unconditionally in a non-treated population, there's potential different levels of trust. And if you now compare, like, in gray, white men responses versus in red, everyone else, you see white men systematically have a higher level of trust relative to female and black survey respondents, independent of which trust question we look at. So now what we want to understand is whether the people increase their level of trust, women and black survey respondents increase the level of trust when they see Mary Daly or Raphael Bostich relative to seeing Thomas Barkin. So the way we want to do that now, we create a dummy variable that equals 1. If a survey participant has a low level of trust, so 1, 2, or 3, and we want to see whether it is actually very systematically the share of survey respondents that have a low level of trust depending on who they saw in the survey experiment. So same setup as earlier. So the left panel, white survey respondents, right panel, black survey respondents, light gray female, dark gray male survey respondents. So what we see here, and remember, this is the share of individuals with a low level of trust. So here, if you focus, for example, on the left panel, so white women have like a share of low level of trust of 46% when they see Thomas Barkin, but it goes down to 41 or 42% if they see Mary Daly or Raphael Bostich. So a lower level of distrust, so higher trust, and we show this also survives, in fact, in regressions. The effect is, however, substantially bigger even among black survey respondents. So if, let's say, a black woman sees Thomas Barkin, she has a 46% chance of distrusting him or distrusting the Fed as an institution, but his share goes down to 39% if they see Raphael Bostich or Mary Daly, and we see similar effects within the black male survey population. So indeed, once we make salient in our survey, there's a female or black male representation on the FOMC, there's a lower level of distrust among women and black survey participants. And so the second mechanism I briefly want to shed some light on, is it maybe the case that people just become even more interested in gathering information about monetary policy if it is about currently an underrepresented policymaker, so like a female policymaker on the FOMC. So we indeed see, like, ex ante, there are systematic differences across groups, like, let me skip that. And so, like, in a follower survey, 4 weeks after our main survey, we recontacted our survey population, and we just split them into 3 groups. One group had the choice of an article between an unnamed policymaker from the CBO versus the Federal Reserve. The second group had a choice between Mr. Phil Swagel and Mr. Clarida, so 2 male policymakers, same institution. And the third group had a choice between Mr. Swagel and Mrs. Bowman from the Fed again. And so, like, what we try to understand here, is it the case that women are differentially more likely to choose the Fed article if it is associated with a female policymaker relative to the CBO article and relative to the Fed article that is about a male policymaker? And so here, the way to look at that, here we just split male versus female respondents, and we see that female respondents are about a little bit less than 10 percentage points more likely to choose the Fed article relative the Fed article when it's about a female policymaker relative to the Fed article if it's about a male policymaker, and compared to the difference, so like it's a double difference, so to speak, male respondents and are also slightly more likely to choose the Fed article about a female policymaker. So indeed, it looks like, if it's an article about a female policymaker, women are differentially more likely to actively choose reading this article and then subsequently answering a couple of questions about that. So, like, to leave a couple of maybe.
Can we just? Alina has her hand up, so I'm going to let her ask, and then we'll certainly give you time to finish. Don't worry.
Yeah, thank you. Just a quick question. So since this was a follow-up survey, and I'm sure you had some attrition rate here, could you tell whether the attrition rate was sort of connected to the treatment group the surveys were in, and maybe if they were in the salience group, were they more likely to come back?
So I think at some point we looked at that and didn't see any systematic effect here, but we should look back into that. So like, this is something I skipped over. That's like, what we thought, it's somewhat related, I think, to your question is like, are women and Black survey respondents more likely to spend more time on the survey? And do they state they found it more interesting when they see Bostage or daily relative to Barkin or relative to being in the control group? We do directly see that in the main survey, like they spend about 4% more time when they see Bostage and daily, and marginally more likely to state they found the survey interesting. But I think actually we should indeed check whether we found a differential attrition. If I remember correctly, we didn't see that, but I think that certainly it would be kind of interesting to see that women are more likely to come back if they saw daily or Bostage, and it's the same for Black survey respondents.
And then did you check whether they picked the female article or not? If that is connected to whether they had the saliency treatment? So just comparing.
Yeah, we control for that.
Okay.
I don't remember whether we also looked at a sample split or an interaction effect. I think that would be interesting, whether there's an additional kick based on that. So that's something we certainly should look into. That's a great question indeed.
Thank you.
And so here, let me just briefly mention, based on those results, we think our results are more consistent with a taste for diversity rather than homophily, because if it was a pure homophily story, we would have expected that, let's say women are more responsive to daily than to Barkin and then to Bostage, because Barkin at least shares their race relative to Bostage. But, those are a couple of things that are not consistent. It's like, let me just maybe stop here briefly. We try to understand whether making salient the minority representation of the female and Black male representation of the FOMC might matter for the extent to which certain subpopulation take into account the identical provided forecast into their own expectations. And we did see that women and Black survey respondents increase the level of trust, are more likely to use the information, and in fact actually are more likely to actively acquire information about the Fed once it is associated with a female or Black male policymaker. But of course, there are many dimensions we cannot really talk about in our setup. We don't know what the optimal degree of diversity is, how persistent these effects are, and things like that. So having a couple of minutes left, hopefully I see lots of questions popping up in the chat. We have a little bit of time in getting at those.
Perfect. Thank you, Michael. That was fascinating. Covered not just one paper, but a lovely long introduction, which we already grilled you on. I'm going to kick things off specifically on this front, and I'm going to play the CEPR card, and I'm going to focus on the European. Okay, so I mean, I guess an interesting question, and this directly relates to Alina's research on this, but I guess it'd be interesting to hear your views about whether you think, or I mean, in the US, I'll do it in two parts. In the US, did you look at any sort of links between states and their association? California is a bigger state, so maybe Californians and other people out west just like to hear from someone like them, and they don't trust those Northeasters, or versus someone from Virginia or from Georgia. I have no idea, by the way, whether I know Mary Daly is from California. I have no idea whether Bostic or Barkin are actually from Georgia and Virginia, respectively. But so that's one question. And then extrapolating to Europe, do you think that I mean, clearly gender. I mean, one thing I took away from what you had, the effects of the sort of female effects, and given you spoke about the gender differences in inflation expectations, that's clearly a problem that Europe would also face. And so that's a clear takeaway. I guess the second extrapolation, though, from that is the effects on unemployment seem to be much stronger than the effects of inflation. And the ECB has a very clear inflation mandate without the second objective. So When you think about extrapolating this to Europe, have you thought about how these things might interact?
Yeah, no, those are actually both great questions. So like what we did that I think partially goes into the direction of your first question. So we were kind of interested, do people that live in the district of the relevant regional Fed that is covering them react more to seeing, let's say, Raphael Bostic or so, and we didn't see an effect there. So it didn't seem to be like, a kind of a spatial effect. It was more like this gender and race effect that we found, but we thought actually indeed like it would be super interesting. Now, again, like extrapolating that to Europe, I don't think that would be something I would directly apply to the European context, because at least from my casual observation, for example, since Isabel Schnabel is on the ECB board, you see her a lot in German TVs, newspapers, she's very active. And so certainly my impression is that, Germans in particular, also women pay lots of attention to what she says and became more interested in monetary policy after she joined the ECB board. Now, in terms of like inflation versus the unemployment rate, given at least I'm talking more for Germany now, but given that Germans always are so kind of I don't know, have this fetish for inflation and are always concerned for hyperinflation again occurring. So I could now, paired with what I said previously, I could see that if now Isabel Schnabel goes out and keeps on what she's doing, maybe also doing town hall meetings and things like that, that actually she might be indeed very effective. And I think in the European context, in addition to race and gender, what plays a role, this echoes back to your first question, would be the nationality of the policymaker. I think there's a good reason why she has a lot of presence in the German media rather than, let's say, Christine Lagarde, for example. So I think like that's certainly something that this is again like totally outside of our research paper and my own research. This would be me as a casual observer, what I could see potentially being going on in Europe.
Perfect. Rafet, you had your hand up.
I did. So fascinating as expected. Thank you very much. So I'd like to add something onto this diversity study, in the sense that it is true, increasing diversity of policy committees could be beneficial for many reasons, but none of those reasons are why we want more diversity. And I think it's important to be clear on this bit, that we want diversity on its own right, and all of these other things are side effects. And in fact, increasing diversity in policy committees or elsewhere might have costs too, right? And we don't care that much in this sense. So I think it's important to make this point every time we go into these discussions, that we want the right thing for the right reason. The right thing is we want diversity. The right reason is because it's a good thing on its own right. That if your results turned out to be, everybody wanted to listen to the white guy, and in fact, males, females, blacks, whites, whatever, they all thought, no, only when the white guy talks, we pay attention. I don't think we would have said, well, thus, we should go for, white guys everywhere. So, right. I mean, and you haven't said anything to the contrary. It's just that you haven't said anything to this effect either. And I think it should always start with this caveat. So thank you.
No, so Rafa, look, I think I skipped skipped a couple of things that I would normally talk in a longer talk. So like, here one of the bullet points, we specifically say like, even a null result we think could be interesting, or potentially even like could see that, white men react, have less anchored expectations, seeing like Raphael Bostic or Mary Daly, which could have also been interesting. And then we would have let's say, what is potentially the cost of diversity? We just didn't see that. So we actually had all those hypotheses ex ante registered at the AEA, just to make sure that, we are not just mining the data and then whatever comes out of it, we report. So like we indeed actually ex ante thought about, the potential different outcomes and for which reasons one or the other could be potentially interesting. I think, when you say like we want to increase diversity for diversity reasons, I would partially subsume that under the first bullet point here, that ultimately we want to actually mirror the society we serve, that what Christine Lagarde had said. And given that we currently have just the FED hearings or the nomination hearings in the US happening, you might have followed that there are lots of harsh discussions, in particular also in social media, based on purely ideological viewpoints that we think are just difficult to reconcile. So some people say you shouldn't do that. Some people say you should do that, and they bring their arguments, but they typically don't even listen to each other. What we think we can bring to the debate is actually one specific channel via which diversity is beneficial, and we provide economic arguments. What is the upside or the plus of doing so, which potentially proponents and opponents should be able to agree upon, because we use a standard tool set of many of us here that study monetary policy communication, and we show the bright side of diversity or making salient diversity representation. I think that's the way, at least, I'm speaking for myself only, but I think Francesco and Andreas would hopefully largely agree with what I'm saying.
Great. Okay. I'm going to ask one more from the Q&A. I'm just going to say, so Julian Pinter has asked a question which came in sort of a little late, and it's related to the first stuff. So I'm going to hang that over till the very end and thank Julian for the patience on that. Petra Giratz asks, regarding the treatment, they differ not just in terms of their background, but the dress, etc. And you mentioned some of that in your talk. Can you just explain that again, the way in which you controlled for pictures, names, etc.?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's not everything we do in the paper, but it's a little bit in this direction. So what we did in a follow-up survey on MTurks, we were not directly recontacting the same population, just because of some of the things Alina was referring to. Maybe after our treatments, people indeed become more interested in female policymakers and stuff like that. So we just went to MTurk, had a population of about 1,000 people, and we showed them the pictures, same 3 pictures, previously most likely not having seen those pictures. And so then we just said, well, do you recognize this person in the picture? How trustworthy do you think this person is? What do you think is the job of this person? And so one thing is, by and large, if you look at it, it's between 5 and 7%, might actually recognize the person, or might actually, in fact, think that the person works in the private sector. The only thing that stands out a little bit, people actually think that they recognize Raphael Bostic, but then if you look, do you think this person works in the public sector? The share is just below 5% as for all the other survey participants. So it looks like people, African American survey participants, men and female, do think they recognize Raphael Bostic, but actually, in fact, when you actually ask them, what job does he have, they in fact actually don't recognize him. It's like a false positive, so to speak.
Great. Okay, so there's 2 other questions here from us. So I'm going to go to Julia next, and then Luba after that.
Julia?
Sorry. I thought it was my second question. No, I had two points. One, thank you for this paper. I think it's very nice. It's very important for, I'm talking now as a policymaker. Like you all know that we went through a strategy review at the Euro area system in the last couple of years. So a lot of studies on communication and ECB listen, and we did listen at national levels at the PAN de France, and so this question of how policymaker representativity and diversity, it's important, and and there are studies have been made that indeed they show that so in an occasional paper of the ECB on the communication group, that there is a positive relationship between knowledge of the ECB and trust in the ECB, and there is a negative relationship between trust in the ECB and inflation expectations. So there are other studies for sure to make on this. And related to one of the questions of the audience, I was thinking, given that you show that basically there are very few people that know these policymakers, you could in principle randomize much more and just put some picture with I don't know, logo of the ECB or the Fed or whatever you like, taken randomly, and also control for possible omitted variables, because there could be that beauty or age are also important variable that you cannot really discriminate just with 3 pictures. So I was thinking, maybe given the fact that policymakers are unknown by the public, you can do more than with the governments where everybody know, you know, like ministers, but they don't know policymakers of the, central bankers.
No, Julia, I totally agree with what all you said. So like, there's certainly many more things and dimensions we do want to look at, and hopefully also others actually start looking into, like, as we say, like, part of that, I would almost say here, we try to, like, the wording, the dissemination mode, and all of those things, like the optimal degree of diversity and all of that stuff, like our simple setup, like cannot really answer. Like, what we were mainly trying to focus on was, in a reasonably clean setting, do we actually find that indeed, like, making salient the representation of women and minority policymakers on the FOMC plays a role? But I think, like, I totally agree with you. Let's say it's short, that there's so much more we can do and should do indeed.
Okay, Luba?
Last experimentation with the visuals was very interesting, and I think difficult to do, because it's very hard to get the visuals comparable and only vary gender. One thing that, and kind of building on what Petra was saying, one thing that really struck out at me was that Barkin and Daly both had their arms crossed, while Bostic didn't. And psych literature has shown that speakers that have crossed arms tend to come across as more defensive and guarded, and in particular less confident. And I can imagine that might influence trust, but that didn't seem to work against Bostic. So anyway, I wonder if you had experimented much with other photos besides the ones that you presented today.
Luba, it's a great point. Like, totally agree with you. Like, also the body language, Mary Daly was smiling, the others looked more serious. Those are all a couple of things, like, as you said, like, ideally you would want to keep all of those things constant, but unfortunately, next time maybe we can convince them to go for a photo shooting and then tell them how they should look in the pictures. But we try to look into through those auxiliary surveys on Amtrak afterwards, just to see, like, whether there's a differential, credibility, level of confidence, level of expertise, and we didn't see that. So the only noticeable difference, in addition to, like, this false positive name recognition for Raphael Bostic, was that there was a slightly higher probability that people thought that actually Mary Daly is a high school teacher, just because she comes across as such a lovely person smiling, and people didn't think that you saw that there's a really small chance that people thought she's like a public sector official. But not to say that the other actually 2 pictures had a high share. It was also less than 5% of people thinking that they were working in the public sector.
Okay, perfect. I feel just before we get to the end of the hour and 15, I'm going to ask Julian's question, and thanks again for the patience. It's a beginner question linked to the point about using home scan data. When we use home scan data to analyze the link between expectations and consumption, to what extent should we be concerned that a kind of treatment to carefully pay attention to past prices is at play here, reinforcing such a link?
That's certainly always important caveat to keep in mind. It's like, we look at a population that over the years has actually scanned all the goods they're purchasing. So certainly, like, we might expect that there's potentially some selection into those people just thinking more about prices in general. And that's why it plays a role for their thinking about inflation expectations. That's why I think, some of the work Michael was mentioning earlier from Israel, or like Ricardo Perestrulia, I think with Alberto Carvalho and others, have done related studies in Argentina and the work in Israel that was mentioned earlier, where you also find that. So you directly go to people in the supermarket, you scan kind of their grocery bill, and then you kind of ask them what they think the current price of goods is, what the past price is, and what they think inflation will be going forward. You see actually very consistent results with what we show in this home scan panel. That's why I think, like, in general, I would be also concerned about that, but I think at least from other countries, there's evidence that is consistent with what we find at the micro level in the US. Like, I think this mechanism of people paying to prices of goods they purchase frequently and more to positive, the negative price change, I think most likely we can also take away to other settings outside of the home scan and outside of the US.
Okay, perfect. Well, we are right on time. Let me thank everybody for taking part. We had a very good crowd, about 170 at some points. So, Michael, you brought the crowd in. I'm very pleased that you seem to get a lively discussion as well. So hopefully you and your researcher colleagues got something out of it, and there's some future papers to write. And just to say to everybody that keep watching your emails. We will send the details about the next talk, which will take place next month. So on behalf of everybody at the CEPR and particularly the Research Policy Network, thank you to Michael and thank you to everyone, and have a good rest of the day.